All right. Well, thanks for being with us tonight. This is the fourth week out of four. What we've been doing is looking at the how to understand the Bible. This really is, honestly and truly, a passion of mine. It is I really feel passionate about helping people understand the Word. I've addressed this in previous lessons or previous weeks, but I'll say it again here. I think that a lot of the problem that we encounter with believers or Christians in America that don't necessarily study or read like what we may want, or like what people are told to read. I don't think it's necessarily always an issue of a lack of desire. I think that people want to read the Bible. I think that a lack of knowledge or how to make it make sense. I think that's often uh, a hurdle that they can't get over, and so they try it, and it's either it gets boring, or they don't know how to digest what they're eating, and so they end up getting nothing out of it, and it just goes by the wayside. And so really, that's a lot of the impetus for why I wanted to do this 4 week teaching, especially leading into the new year. A lot of people make New Year's resolutions about they're going to read the Bible, or whether they're successful in the past or not at doing that. A lot of people start an annual 1 year reading cycle, and so in the lead up to that, that was a lot of the idea behind this as well, to enable people to get something out of it. So if you've been a part of this and you think it's useful information, if you think there's things that's been discussed, whether previously or perhaps in tonight's, I'll go ahead and do a little bit of a commercial and tell you, connect this stuff, this content, with people that need it. If you think it'll help somebody, that's what I really want to do, is help somebody. Obviously, the more the better, but help people really develop a passion for the Word by seeing how it all really does fit together. It really does make sense once you understand how to make it make sense. It was created by the most intelligent mind there is, the intelligent creator behind everything. And so there's one writer, or there's one author with many writers. And once you see that mind of the one author, God, obviously, the Spirit of God, once you see that, the whole thing really does make sense. So that's just how I wanted to start off tonight. Help me connect this. I'm posting on YouTube and Facebook. If you think it's helpful for anybody, send it to whoever you think it'll be helpful for. Uh, so, all right. So tonight, let me try to do a screen share. This is our last night, and it's going to be a little bit different than previous weeks. Uh, Tonight, I'm not going to take quite as long, and we're going to get into, uh, if I can do two things at once. Uh, we're going to get into studying the Bible, or how to study the Bible. Uh, so in the past few weeks, the first week we talked about how to approach the Bible. It's God's word. It's the story of His relationship with all of His creation, both the world and humanity. Then we talked about how the Bible is segmented, how it's put together, how it's constructed. Then we talked about the narrative, the meta narrative of the Bible. That was week 2. The entire story and how it all fits together, the story that the Bible tells. Then in week 3, last week, we talked about the language of the Bible, and I like talking about that because you have to understand the terminology, the vocabulary that the Bible speaks, and not just assume that we know it in our 21st century American culture and context. We have to place ourselves in the language of the Bible, and I believe that the mind of God has revealed, uh, you know, to those who have a desire and a heart to know, He has made it knowable. If we take the first step, then He'll do His part in making sure that He grants us revelation. Uh, and so, studying the language of the Bible, the law, the feasts, the priesthood, sacrifices, and I'm leaving one out, the tabernacle. That's the language that the Bible speaks. It's written in such a way that if you're not familiar with those concepts that were laid out all the way back in the book of beginnings, God gave his Torah, his law, his instruction, the first 5 books. He gave that to build the foundation of his self-revelation. And so any knowledge about God that doesn't begin there, it's a faulty premise. We're not going to come up with the right conclusions if we start with a bad foundation. So tonight we're going to get into studying the Bible, and some of this will be conceptual and some of it will be actual tools or strategy and tactics. A lot of it is mindset that we've already covered. I've been talking a lot in the conceptual stage about how to understand the Bible, and it'll continue tonight with the studying the Bible segment that we're doing. How to approach the Bible, how to think about the process of studying, and then there will also be I'll show you at the end. We're going to talk about we'll talk about the way that I'll give an example on a screen share of how I actually study the Bible. So, like I said, I'm doing a little bit different. I think I have this divided into 7 main points that I want to make. So, number 1, first, is there anything that anybody would like to say, either about previous week's questions, about clearing anything up, or anything related to tonight's upcoming lesson, or anything that I've said so far? I want to give that opportunity. All right. Okay, so first, I think it's important when we study the Bible to keep the text in its proper context. So if you're new to reading the Bible and you're about to undertake this new undertaking, if you're about to embark on this new adventure of trying to finally read the entire Bible or try to finally understand it, one of the things, and these are not they're not necessarily in order. One of the biggest things is to keep the text in its proper context. So I like to use this joke or analogy or whatever that I grew up hearing. So there was somebody that they were in some kind of problem, the story goes, and some kind of crisis, and they needed an answer from God, and so they decided to open up the Bible, and whatever God showed them in the Bible is what they would take as the solution. So they open it up to, what is it, Matthew 27:5. It's talking about Judas, and it says he went away and hanged himself. He said, well, this can't be God. I don't know about this. Let's try this again. So he opened it up to a second location, and it was John 13:27. And it says, what you do quickly. Ha ha ha, it laughs, right? So we can't take isolated verses out of context. We can't just pick and choose the verses that we want to use and disregard the rest. There has to be a context to the verse, how it fits in, and really that's what a lot of this is about. Really, what it boils down to, the past 3 weeks, is trying to provide that proper context with the specific books, but how it fits into the overall story in general. So keeping the text in its proper context is vitally important, and people use and abuse this so much. Some do it, I think, with good motives and out of ignorance. And I don't say ignorance in like you're unintelligent, but ignorance as a lack of knowledge. They don't know any better. They're just doing what they've been told to do. They're perpetuating the system that they've inherited about how to interpret the word. But it really leads to a lot of problems. And so what we want to do is to rightly divide the word of truth. That's what all this is about. Rightly divide the word of truth. So we have to keep the text in its proper context. The second one that I want to point out is let the word speak to you, not the other way around. Now, in seminary and academic type settings, this will be, this will be under the category of exegesis and eisegesis. But I wanted to use language that I actually understand. So let the word speak to you, not the other way. Don't tell the Bible, don't read into the Bible what you want it to say. What we have to do is not, you've heard me talk about this. We don't want to ask, what does this mean to me? That is not the best and highest interpretive construct for how to make sense of the Bible, because we can come up with all kinds of stuff based on our own understanding, our own misunderstanding, our own intelligence or lack thereof. There's so many things that can go wrong when we make the interpretive standard, what do I think this means? So what we want to do is, what does this mean? What did this mean to the writer and the audience? We have to let the word speak to us, not tell the word what we want it to say. And of course, if I was preaching, I could go on a rabbit trail and talk about the various political and sexual ideologies going around these days, because they make the word say whatever they want to. But there are less extreme examples that I could pull from that aren't as obvious and blatantly sinful. But we still do this a lot, even those of us who are well-meaning. When we read the word through eyes that already know what they want to see. And a lot of times what I've found, I'll just go ahead and say this too. I've found that a lot of my journey, not that I've arrived by any means, I'm still a student, I'm still learning for sure. But up to this point, I know that a lot of my learning has been having to unlearn and to see through eyes that aren't, influenced by a certain shade of lens, or that aren't filtering, that doesn't filter things through what I already know, air quotes, what I already know to be true. So it's a real challenge, but also a skill set, I think, that we can develop in questioning our own assumptions when we look at a passage in the Word that we've read a million times, that we've heard preached a million times, and say, yes, I know for sure that I know what this passage means. We have to have humility in making sure that we let the Word, like I say, let the Word speak to us. Let the Bible tell us what it's trying to say, instead of telling the Bible what we want it to say. The third thing I want to mention tonight in how to study, another conceptual level, is to keep the forest in sight. And what I mean by this, it's a play on the old the saying or the expression, "You miss the forest for the trees." And I think this is very helpful advice personally when it comes to studying the Bible. It's very easy to get bogged down in the details of specific symbolism of the turtle dove sacrifice, or what was the significance of the, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I can't think of good examples, but I'm sure that you can think of examples for me where you've either heard sermons, or perhaps some of us have even preached sermons, where we try to focus in so hardcore on one or two little details, instead of stepping back and making sure that we see the forest instead of just the specific trees. We have to keep the forest in sight. And this, I guess this is another way, or this is another subset. This is related to the very first thing I mentioned, is about keeping everything in context. But it's a little bit different in that when we keep the storyline in mind, when we keep the whole arc, it keeps us grounded, and it prevents us from going off in a direction, on on our own and getting weird ideas, basically, and getting weird ideas, weird doctrines, building entire like movements around one or two isolated verses and say, "Yep, this is what it's all about. I found the secret." No, if you just focus on one tree, you're going to miss the entire forest. So, for those of us who have been studying for a while, that's important. But also those of us who may be new to the Bible or new to really studying it in depth, don't don't lose sight. You got to keep the main thing the main thing. That's another saying that I like. Uh, keep the forest in sight. So here's one. Number 4, we have to be consistent in our interpretation. And so we have to use the same standard, I believe. We don't want to make everything allegorical, spiritual in one part of the Bible when it suits us, and then literal, historical in another part of the Bible when it suits us. We want to have the same consistent approach in how we look at things. We can't, and this one also overlaps with the one about reading into the Bible, or letting the word speak for itself. A lot of times, what we do is that we will change our interpretive construct. We change how we approach how to interpret based on the passage and the location. I think one of the biggest examples of this is how I think all of Christendom, really, y'all have heard me talk about this, it shouldn't come as a shock. This is kind of a big part of what I believe. I think that Gentile Christianity over the past several hundred or perhaps thousands of years has really been inconsistent in how they interpret the apostolic writings, which is obviously the New Testament, what we call the New Testament, and the Tanakh, or what we call the Old Testament. There's different interpretive constructs used based on theological standpoints. They have theological axe to grind. And so we may not be that grandiose in our own personal Bible study, but that same thing does apply. And it comes, it presents a challenge to us if we're going to really understand what the word is trying to say. We can't have different weights and balances, to use biblical language. We have to use the same approach to all of it. And I'm going to talk about that here in a slide or two. I have a separate one just to talk about this. And this is related. Keep this one and number 4 in mind for our next slide after this. So number 5, let Bible interpret Bible. Let the word interpret the word. We don't need to put our own spin, our own meaning. We don't need to listen to whoever lived in 400 AD or whoever came along and changed things in 1600 AD. And we don't need to have all of this outside opinion, which really that's all it is. Some people would disagree with me so strongly on that, but I don't care. This is a hill I'm going to die on. I don't care how long ago they lived or how famous they are. Men are just men. Commentaries are just opinions. That's the way I see it. So it doesn't mean that they're always wrong, and it doesn't mean that my opinion is necessarily better or worse. It just that it's a man's opinion, and that's what commentaries often are. And really, one of the things, since I've gotten serious about studying the word, one of the things that I found frustrating at some point was frustrating, but also humorous. Once you unplug from the matrix, you see that really you go to these people that you are viewed as credible and that you yourself may view as credible, but really they're all just quoting each other. I mean, it's nothing new. They're like, this word means such and such because so and so said so, and so said so because other homeboy said so, and all this. It's just kind of a circular thing, and there's very little new. And there are things that have developed and become ingrained in our Christian DNA because people have just said it over and over. We've repeated it for so many hundreds of years now that people just accept certain doctrines. They accept certain interpretations of the Bible instead of letting the Bible speak to us, letting the Bible define itself. Uh, and so when I say let the Bible interpret the Bible, you know, there, a really good way of doing this is the rule of first mention. Uh, this is not a law of first mention, and I can't say it's 100% foolproof. I haven't tested every word in the Bible to hold against this tool or this guide, whatever. But the law of first mention basically says what is the first time a word is used, and that can generally, especially when it's used in Hebrew. The Hebrew Bible tells us a lot, and there's a lot built into the language of Hebrew itself. I'm not there in my studies yet. I keep telling myself that at some point I will eventually learn the language, but that is not this day. Uh, but when we look at words in the Hebrew Bible, especially in Torah, there's often great significance given to the first meaning. Everybody on this call tonight has been around me enough. You've heard me say this. Uh, One of my favorite examples of this is the word grace, and I especially like this word to illustrate this point because you know I was at one point in the hyper grace ditch. There's a ditch on both sides of the road, right? And I was firmly planted in the hyper grace ditch. And I was one of those that, grace is a New Testament concept and the Old Testament is just done away with. I was one of those that I preach and teach against. Uh, and so grace, I found out the first time it was mentioned was Genesis chapter 6, way back in the book of beginnings, even before Abraham. God mentions the word grace. And I think the King James may translate it as favor. Noah found favor in the eyes of God, but that word is grace. And so, what does grace do? Well, there's a lot that we can learn about God's grace just by following not just that word, but that story. The grace of God uh, gave Noah a plan of salvation, which he was able to choose whether to participate in or not. And so I think that can teach us a principle, midrashically, if you will, when we search on a deeper level. It gives us a principle that God is trying to tell us. Can that be abused? Yes, of course, for sure. But this is a method, a tool in our tool belt to interpret the Bible, to let the Bible interpret the Bible. Another big one is the word love. When is the first time love is mentioned? Abraham loved his son. A really big one that this gets into my my personal uh, uh, I don't even passion, I guess. I don't want to use pet peeve. I was trying to think of a better word than pet peeve. That's the wrong connotation. But one of my personal passion points is the word salvation itself. This started a few years ago, and it's only accelerated and grown really in my mind, in my life, in my studies. This concept that we throw salvation around so loosely, yet we don't ever go back and look at when it was mentioned previously in the Bible. So letting the Bible interpret the Bible instead of coming along 2,000 years later and ascribing to it whatever meaning we want. Let the Bible interpret the Bible. Go back and study the rule of first mention. That is one way, not foolproof, but it is a excellent way to help us understand the deeper things of the Bible. All right, so I'm going to summarize a few of these that I've mentioned because, like I said at the beginning, they do all overlap in some way. So exegesis, you heard me say that word. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but exegesis is basically the interpretation of a biblical text. How we exegete means to draw out, out of. Exegete means to draw out of a text, to interpret a biblical text. Here's another word that we all have heard, if even if we don't know it: hermeneutics. This is this is similar but different from exegesis in that hermeneutics is the principles that we use on how to interpret. It's kind of like our operating system, or uh, our the rules by which we interpret. The principles. And these two things are related, but they're different. We have to exegete properly, but in order to exegete properly, we have to have a solid, consistent hermeneutic. Remember what I said, that be consistent in how we interpret text. That's hermeneutics. I personally highly, highly, highly endorse and recommend the historical grammatical method. It's not the only one out there, and I encourage you look into. There's all kinds of resources when it comes to hermeneutics, but really, I don't know of a more reliable one than the historical grammatical method. It's intuitive. I see it as like to me, it's self-evident. We want to look at the history of a passage. We want to look at the meaning of a word in its original historical context and apply that meaning. To me, that is a no-brainer. I don't. I haven't really looked deeply into the arguments against that, or the argument against using a historical grammatical method, because really, it's not something that interests me. I don't need to. I don't need to. The historical grammatical method. I mean, yeah, I'm good with that. The historical grammatical method is looking at the history behind a text, looking at the words used, what is the meaning to the writer, to the audience, what did it mean at that time in history, and then that should be our meaning. And so that should be our big search when we're trying to search things deeper and get deeper revelation and all that. It's not about coming up with a new angle so that we can brand it and write a book and sell a bunch of whatever and get a bunch of followers on social media and take up big offerings, or whatever. I'm speaking from a preacher type of world. We shouldn't look for a unique angle to show just how special we are, or how anointed we are, or how enlightened we are. We need to be looking for the original understanding, the original interpretation. And historical grammatical method, it is that's what it's all about. All right, so getting on, now we're going to talk about a few tactics, or things on the tactical level. I think it's important to have a plan in place. Uh, when we read the Bible, and I think the planning concept can apply on a couple different levels. One is like the time of day. Have a plan in place for when you're going to, where you're going to. Doesn't mean that we always achieve that. We can't be so slavishly devoted to our plan that if we mess up, that it's just like throws us all off track, and it just discombobulates us, and we don't even recover. Uh, that's extreme in another ditch. But I do believe that if we just wing it and say, I want to read the Bible. Okay, great, that's good. But now, what's the next step? When are you going to do it? Are you a morning person? Great. Maybe you can get up 10 minutes, 30 minutes, 5 minutes early, and incorporate your reading time then. If you're like me, what I found is no matter how much I say that I'm going to get up early and read, if I'm tired, it does me no good. So, you know, I can't wake up in the morning tired and get my mind focused on the word. Not consistently, not like as an ongoing thing, maybe for short bursts of time, or for a short while. But I have to be up and about. I'm not a morning person by nature. So I have to have time to get my mind working, to get my mood right, all that kind of stuff. And so I know that if I'm going to effectively study, it's got to be later in the day, once I've had time to get everything going. Uh, at late at night is excellent for me. After everything's quiet, it's just me. Uh, everybody's in bed except for me, and I like that. So a plan acknowledges strengths and weaknesses. It acknowledges reality as it is, not as we wish it were. uh, for somebody who's not a night owl or has evening commitments with family or whatever, then you'd want to make a plan for during the day or during the morning or whatever. So having a plan in place is important in the at the micro level of when and where, right? Where in your house are you going to do it? What time of day? But also, you know, having a reading plan in place for how do we actually read the Bible. And here there are all kinds of reading plans available online. There's Bible apps that will take you through the Bible. There's like I mean, there's how quick do you want to do it, right? How much time are you willing to put into it? I think a really popular one is the Bible in 1 year plan, where it takes you through all. I looked up the number earlier. It's 1,100 and something. It's not quite 1,200 chapters in the Bible. So if you divide that by 365, it's like 3.25 chapters a day. All it takes to read the Bible in 1 year is not even 4 chapters a day out of the Bible. That is eminently doable. But I could get into the spiritual side of things. Why, how is it that we've been convinced that the Bible, we can't read it, we can't know it, we can't understand it? Uh, didn't it say that God was going to restore what the cankerworm had taken and eaten up? What is it? Our wealth? Yeah, I'm sure. He's talking about money always, right? No, he's talking about the word. The word is what has been stolen from us. And so, it's just like, well, we can't understand what the Bible means. We can't understand eschatology. We can't understand what Jesus really said or what he really meant. Hashtag trick of the enemy. I think that is false. But I think we at some level buy into that it's insurmountable. We can't tackle the Bible because it takes too long, or we don't have time, or we can't understand the language, or all these things. But all it takes is less than 4 chapters a day. 4 chapters is nothing if we really want to do that. Some people I hear say that it's 15 minutes a day, depending on how you read. Maybe it's, if you're a slow reader like me, uh, it'll maybe take you 30 minutes a day. But if you're faster, obviously less time. So the point is, what is a plan that you can develop that you will stick to and say, this is how I plan to read and study the Bible. I want to understand it. Whether it's the first time that you've ever undertaken a plan to really study and read and understand the Bible, or if it's your 20th year in a row or whatever, it's good to have a plan. Uh, there's also a way to do it chronologically. You can read the Bible just cover to cover. That's the way I like it. I like to understand how it all fits together in the timeline. So the book of Genesis is written when? So Genesis through Deuteronomy, that's describing what period of time. And then Joshua, where does that lead to? What time period was that roughly? And what happened there? What's the overview? And I like to move through it like that. That was one of the most helpful things when I first finally read the Bible cover to cover, especially when you get to like the Old Testament prophets and everything. So all these weird names, Amos, Obadiah, all these things, is like, how does this fit in? What is this telling me? And understanding it in context to the overall narrative that we've discussed in previous weeks. The divided kingdom. Some of the prophets were from the northern tribes of Israel. Some of the prophets were from the southern tribes of Judah. Understanding the basic overview gave me the ability to understand what I was reading, to comprehend how it all fits together. One, for their time, but also how God layers prophecy. Prophecy and time is circular. It's not linear like what we understand it. So things repeat themselves. And so once we understand the prophets in the past, they were speaking of some that have been partially fulfilled, some prophecies, but also things that will have an ultimate fulfillment at the day of the Lord, which is what we're all waiting on. fitting it together chronologically made a lot of sense for the way my mind works. Perhaps you're not the same. That's fine. Get you a plan that does work. Uh, so you can find Bible in a year plans. You can find the Torah portions, and this is what Judaism does every year. They go through the Torah portion in synagogue, and some people estimate, some historians estimate that this was developed at the time of Ezra. There's broad agreement that the Torah portions were in place at the time of Jesus, when the synagogue system was like really in full effect. People estimate that Ezra began it, but by the time of Jesus, what was it, like 400 years later, then synagogues were a thing. And there's broad agreement that the Torah portions were in place when Jesus was around and preaching in the synagogue. Some people even tie the text from Isaiah that he read that was part of the reading schedule for that week. And that's an interesting thing. I'm not going to get into it here, but if you're interested in it, look it up and see what you think about it. So Torah portions, we can also have a plan to read topically or by category. We can choose to read, like we can group all the epistles, the letters to the churches together, and focus on that. Or we can look at Old Testament prophecy. We can look at historical books. We can group these things together. There's lots of methods. There's lots of things out there that we can use to have a solid plan in place to read the Bible. And so I think that is a big deal. I've spent a lot of time talking about it now that I think about it, but it's really important. Have a plan in place if you want to succeed. And I want you to succeed, whether you've read the Bible one time or many times or 0 times. Let's all read the Bible. Let's have a plan to get it done, to have a passion for it, to understand it, to let it become part of us. All right. I think I alluded to this earlier. I thought that I got ahead of myself a little bit, but the last point that I want to talk about in how we study the Bible is to study words as you study the Word. Word studies are huge. They are like a really big deal in how I understand the Word and how we can really understand what a text is trying to say. So I'm going to go over to a different screen share, if you'll bear with me. Give it time to see if that's working. All right. I haven't even checked the chat tonight. Yeah, I thought about Jared Herman who? There's some of us that have never heard of Mr. Nudix, hermeneutics. All right. So if it's not working, it looks like it is for me. If it's not for you, then just let me know. Otherwise, I will assume that it is. So this is. I just wanted to walk through this with you for anybody that wants to have like, how do I study? how do I use the Bible? So I think the use of concordances, dictionaries, lexicons, these things are so important, and I've taken it for granted. I grew up doing it. I was looking stuff up when I was very young, so it's always just been common knowledge. And I realized that not everybody had the knowledge wasn't necessarily that common. They didn't grow up in the same. They didn't grow up in a preacher's house. So one of the things that we can use, and right here, what this screen that we're looking at, this I wish this had been around instead of all the shelves of books that were required in the past. This is just one. I've used this since I don't know how long, over 10 years. I'm not saying that it's the best. If you have a different one that you like, or if you don't like this one in particular, you want to find another one, great. Whatever is good for you. I'm a creature of habit, so this is just what I know and it's what I use. Uh, I use BibleHub.com. It's just what I use. It's my preference. That's all. All right. So one thing that we can do is look up. Let's go to Genesis 1:14. Okay. So if you want to look up a passage, you can go directly to it. And uh, this is the one we all know where I'm going with this probably. This is where it talks about when God says, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. Let them be for signs and for seasons and for day and for years." So Genesis 1, we're in the creation count, right? So we're going to look at a word study pretty soon. But first, I want to point out like just the format, the layout. You can go to individual verses just by drop down screens, all that. I don't want to make it too simplistic. I mean, I'm assuming that we all have at least a working knowledge of how these things work, but the individual components I think are key. Using a parallel Bible. I remember growing up, there was a four uh, a four parallel translation for the Old Testament and a eight translation uh, parallel Bible for the New Testament. And so basically, what it is just having all these different translations parallel to one another, side by side, that you can look up and see how the wording varies based on the interpretation or on the translation. So I personally like the ESV. I like the NASB. Those are my two favorite. I like the NKJV. Uh, the KJV, it's it's surprisingly controversial. I still don't understand on both sides why people are so either tied to it or against it. I get the pros and cons of the King James, but just like any other translation, there's some good, some bad. That everything has pros and cons. Uh, but these are all the different translations that you can look from, and it's good, I think, so that one thing that you'll see preachers do. Unfortunately, it's funny. You'll see that. I hope none of us here are guilty of this. I know that I actually have been in the past. So, like, they'll be reading from the NIV for 80-90% of the verses they use, but then they'll pull out a NLT or like some random uh, CSB or just whatever. They'll pull out some different random translation because the wording of it supports what they're trying to say in a way that none of the rest of the translations do. It like maybe interprets a word a little bit differently, and it helps them prove the point that they're trying to get to in their sermon or whatever. And they do pull things out of context. It's funny, but using a parallel Bible, the point is using a parallel Bible will keep you from doing that. If you find one verse that has pink unicorns and everything else is talking about purple elephants, maybe you shouldn't talk about pink unicorns or purple elephants because it's probably not the Bible. All right. Uh, so so that's the parallel. And so now what I really like to do is an interlinear. This was a separate thick book commentary dictionary that I would go to in the past when I was growing up before we had electricity and the internet. Uh, so the interlinear, what it does is it gives the literal translation of a passage. So you'll see here it has the words in Hebrew and then the rough translation in English underneath it. And what this does is uh, it gives the literal meaning of the words that are being translated, but it's not very easy to read, right? Because there's differences in language, there's differences in verb conjugation, verb tense. You have the Latin related languages that are all masculine and feminine. So there's differences in where adjectives go and how to modify them. There's just differences in language, and so an interlinear gives a literal translation of each individual word, but it's not meant to be read like you're speaking the English language, right? Uh, and so you can look up each individual word. And so the one that I want to use, because it's an example I use all the time in my teaching, is this word seasons. Okay. So uh, we click on this, we open it up, and it'll give us the definition. So it takes us to the Hebrew word moed, and it has that definition of what it means. It has a concordance that will list all the different times that it's used and the different ways, because it's translated seasons in some places, and then other place, Leviticus 23 most prominently, is it's translated feast. So what we really want to do is, what is the definition? Why is it translated as one word in one place and a different word in another place? So we want to look at the definition. I hope that this is like, I hope I'm going through this in a way that makes sense if you've never heard this before, but it's not just brutally like simplistic if you already know what I'm talking about. Uh, so those are very key ways. Those are some specific tools that I like to use. Is a concordance that lists all the uses of a specific word, an interlinear that gives the literal translation. You have the dictionary that gives the definition of the original language. Uh, you have the parallel Bible to see how different English translators have chosen to translate a certain passage just for comparison's sake. There's safety in a multitude of counselors is the way I view that. Uh, and of course, I haven't even talked about the simple search function, like so faith. So just do a search for faith, for instance. My internet's being slow. And so there you go. Like it'll give you all these results for Hebrew. Do you want the Greek word for it? Do you want the Hebrew word for it? You can come down and it'll have like the Bible passages, the concordance. Online tools are great if you want to study a specific word. I'm going to go back to our notes. Close that out so it stops eating up my internet. So study the words in the word. That's a very big deal. That's a very key concept in understanding the Bible. If there's something that you read that you don't really know or understand, you come across it, take the time to look it up. What do other passages in the Bible have to say about it? What's the law of first mention or the rule of first mention? When's it first mentioned in the Bible? Uh, what what what's the Greek translation of the word if it's New Testament? What's the Hebrew? What's the literal translation of the word, not the way the English writers have translated it? Word studies are huge, and it will take you so far in understanding how the Bible really works. The problem with that I've encountered, that I've seen others do commonly, and that I have unfortunately engaged in myself, is that a lot of times we can twist, not twist, but like uh, selectively edit our search results. Does that make sense? We can keep trying to make it fit just one little key meaning so that we can get our theological point across. We can have our axe to grind, uh, and so that our little pet doctrine, if we're not careful, we can use these tools to in a harmful way. Uh, Instead of being helpful, we use it to our own detriment and the detriment of others if we're actually in a position to be able to teach and to influence the way others think about the word. So we really want to make sure that we are being consistent to the word, let the context speak, all these things that I mentioned. Let don't miss the forest for the trees. Let's keep the meta narrative at the forefront. Let the Bible interpret itself. All these things as we study the word. That's we want to know what the Bible says. That, at least To me, that's the way I view it. To me, that's the way we should all view it. I want to know, I am highly interested in what the Bible is trying to say to me. In times past, I've been really interested in trying to make the Bible say what I wanted it to say. And, probably there are ways that there may be ways that I'm blind to currently that it'll only take even more time of study and reflection and prayer, just keeping myself humble before God. Maybe down the road, I'll see other things that other theological pet doctrines that I have now that I'm not willing to question and let the Bible speak for itself. I don't know. I think I've done most of that at this point, but you never know. You can't see what you can't see. So that's why it's so important to stay humble, stay a student of the word, no matter how advanced that we get. We have to stay a student to let our teacher, the Holy Spirit of God, teach us. We have these tools at our disposal. We have more knowledge than we've ever had. We have so much access to knowledge. All that stuff that I was showing you on the Bible software, that there's so many of those out there. There's free ones, there's paid ones. Man, that would be like a fortune, like just a generation or two ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, to have all of that, had to have access to that. Not just would you have to have the shelf space, but you'd have to have the money to buy it. You have to have the ability to even understand that these tools exist. Knowledge is valuable, and it was very like uh, uh, it was guarded and safeguarded at the top, if you will. Not necessarily like there's a conspiracy. I'm not going there, but just that now knowledge is democratized, and there's nobody without excuse. There's nobody who has any excuse for not knowing the word other than they simply don't want to. Uh, there's nothing holding us back. If we want to study, there is every tool available at our disposal to study God's word and to really understand it, through prayer, through teachers, through commentaries, through lexicons, all these things that we've been talking about. Uh, if you want to know the word, there's nothing holding you back. So I think I'm going to end there. I have a few notes. I'm just that I didn't put up on the slides, but I think I've probably covered it in my ramblings. I think some common mistakes that we make is, you've heard me talk about this a lot. What does this mean to me? Instead of what does this mean to the audience? Building entire doctrines on one or two isolated verses. There are entire denominational movements in America that have done this. It, baffling. Applying modern understandings to ancient words or phrases, just assuming that the meaning of a word now is what it meant back then. But man, just within my lifetime, there are words now that have a completely different meaning than when I was like in elementary school or even high school, just 20 years ago or 30 years ago. How much in thousands of years is a word going to be different, or hundreds of years? So applying modern understandings to ancient words or phrases is a huge mistake that we make. And just generally the concept of eisegesis, reading into the text. I didn't think that these merited their own notes. I mean, I've covered them all pretty much anyway. I just wanted to mention it to make sure. Uh, so tonight's a shorter night. I don't want to prolong it just for the sake of prolonging it. It was short and sweet, to the point, hopefully. Does anybody have any comments and want to open it up before we go? Take take us off screen share. Uh, and while you're thinking or unmuting, I'm going to check the chat, see what's going on. All right. Are there any specific questions about anything, anything at all, over not just this week or previous, or but also previous weeks? Uh, if you're thinking about the question, I'll go ahead and say, as we're approaching the end of our time, just reach out to me if you don't have my personal information. You can reach me at Sean at e412.org, e412.org. That's the name of our ministry. It's for Ephesians 4:12, and mainly I'm speaking to anybody who may stumble upon this on YouTube or whatever. Everybody on this call has my information. You know how to get a hold of me. But if there's ever anything that I can do to help, uh, let me know. Talk to me. I'd love to hear from you. I love talking about the Bible. I even love talking about the Bible with people that disagree with me. Uh, you know, I really do. You're free to be wrong. Uh, I'm free to be right. No, I'm just playing. I just like talking about the Bible, and there are just so few people who actually do it. Everything is usually centered on sports or what's going on and whatever. That's the way people talk. So I find it so refreshing when I actually find somebody that likes talking about the Bible. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody, for being here. Love you all. Hope this was helpful, and we'll see you down the road.